Okay, so I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, this looks good, but how do I use this for my own game? I mean, obviously, I don't have these characters. That's a good question. I've tried to make this fairly easy to reuse for your own purpose. So you should really need a minimal amount of scripting to reuse this for your own endeavors. So let's have a look. If we go under modding and we go scripting, we can immediately notice that we've got a global script, and then we have scripts associated with each character. So basically, in the global area, we have the scripts for making all of this stuff work. What we have under the characters is the definitions for the various stats for the character and what kind of rolls are to be made. So let's have a look here at our cleric Rurid, for example. The easiest way to customize this for your own character, you can either just rename the object or copy the script, paste it in, and then modify it. So you can see that an attempt here has been made to make this as generic as possible. So for example, even though this script is for Rurid, the character Rurid, that name does not appear anywhere further on in here. So this script can be very easily reused for somebody else. So what we do have here is we need a reference to the dice that are being used by that character. These are just the GUIDs, so you can very easily click on each of the dice and do a right click, and you should be able to get the GUID there, and you'll fill those in. Important thing to note is if you need to roll a dice multiple times, you can't do that with this framework. You need to define a second die. That's why, for example, you can see here, there's a D4, a D4x2, basically the second D4, and a D4x3. That's so that 4 D4s could be rolled at once. Obviously, once the roll is finished, that die can be reused to make the same roll again, but in a single roll, a single die can't be used twice. The framework does not support that. So this is just defining the references to the dice that are to be used. In theory, you could have all of these pointing to communal dice, but typically you don't want to do that because when you ask players to roll initiative, if a roll is in progress, those dice can't be used again. So if you were using communal dice, each player would have to wait until the next player to make rolls. By each player having their own set of dice, basically characters can make those rolls in parallel. We have here just a configuration for the pronoun to be used, his or hers. That's used for the descriptions of the things rolled. It's optional. You could actually hard code his or her in all of the messages, but again, this is added there so that if you would like to, for example, for all your skills, to just put the character's name rolled his or her skill name, then you can do that, and that way you can then copy and paste that exact same script for a male or a female character, and it won't matter because all you will need to do is update this in one place instead of going through all the messages. Okay, we also have some definitions here. We have the hit point total that's shown up there, the AC total that's shown up there. Those are max. The framework currently doesn't track the current hit points. I will have a update for that soon, but at the moment it's just showing the max hit points. We also have a definition of the touch AC and the flat-footed AC. They are currently not being displayed. They're not really being used right now, but can be in the future. And then we basically have a definition for each one of those roles. So those are defined here, and they have a bunch of parameters. Some of them are mandatory, some of them are optional. So in this particular case, we have a combat category. So this is basically the category. It doesn't really show up here at all, but it's just used to differentiate these 5 pull-down menus. So like I said, normally I associate the first one with combat-oriented stuff, so I call it a combat. And then the second part here is the name associated with what you're rolling. So in this case, this is initiative. This just defines that this entry exists in the pull-down list. And then we have a few optional stuff here. So if you define anim, that's short for animation, this will trigger one of the animations that you have defined on your character. Obviously, if you're using characters that do not have animations on them, you can just leave this out. The default is no animation. If your animation number starts with 100, it uses the looping animation. And if it's just a like 1, 2, 3, 4, less than 100, it uses the triggering animation. Again, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. You'll understand what that means if you create some animated characters, possibly using the tutorial that I mentioned earlier, which I will reference later. Next, we have another optional parameter called speech. If you would like, you can use a text-to-speech website that's by default placed on the GM's tablet. And if you put text here, it will actually do a text-to-speech conversion for basically what the character says when that skill is rolled. Again, if the speech is empty, it won't do anything. Then we have a mandatory category of die. This indicates the die that is to be rolled. Note that these die rolls should be prefixed by the letter D. And do note that it's just the die, so don't try to add any kind of modifiers or any kind of math operations that is not supported. Just basically a D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, D20. Yes. Basically it's any of the dice that you have defined up above here. Then we have the mod property. That basically is a minus or plus value to be added to your D20 roll. So for example, if we're talking about initiative and your character has a +4 initiative, you would have D20, and under mod you'd have 4. If they had a negative, you would put a negative number there. And lastly, we have the text property. The text property is what is written to the chat window when the result is displayed. And there are a few placeholders. Anything in the brace brackets is basically a placeholder. So there's a placeholder for player. If you add that into your text, it will get replaced with whatever the player's character's name is. The role placeholder will be replaced with what the actual roll die was. The mod will get replaced with what the value of the modifier was, and the total will get replaced with whatever the total of the roll plus mod is. And of course, you can also have the placeholder of pronoun, which gets replaced by his or hers or its or whatever you decide to define here with your pronoun. If you need to roll multiple dice, then instead of using die and mod and text, you use die 1, mod 1, text 1, die 2, mod 2, text 2, and so on. And I'm looking at here and I already see a mistake. So we can see there's die 1 mod 1 text 1, die 2 mod 2 text 2, and there's a third die here. That should be die 3 mod 3 text 3. There is no real limit in the number of dice that you can roll. Obviously, it is somewhat limited by the number of dice you've defined here, because none of them can be rolled twice in a roll. But I could be rolling all of these dice if I wanted to, just by doing die 4, die 5, die 6. It is important to note not to skip any numbers, because as soon as it doesn't find the next die, it'll stop trying. So for example, if I made this die 4, mod 4 and text 4, it would only roll the 2, and then it would stop trying to look for other ones. So that's how we define the different roll macros. With the unim property, it is also possible to do a again, a die roll, and that will randomly choose the number for the animation. So for example, my characters are set up with 6 different attack animations. All of them actually look the same, but they have different battle quotes associated with them. So here, instead of having a preset value for the animation, it's a d6. So basically, it's a random choice of the attacks, which will all look the same, but will then just have randomly selected battle quotes. So that's basically it for configuring the character portion. As we can see, we've got the combat section. Again, this doesn't have to be combat. I use that as my my convention, but you don't need to. But we can see that there's all the combat related stuff. Now we've gone on to the second section. So it's a different section. It's going to be a different entry here, and so on and so forth. There is a need at the beginning of each section to indicate what the default selection here is. And at the moment, the pull down will always default to the alphabetically first entry. And that's what you need to put here for the selection. If you try to put anything else here, the default roll will not sync. So for example, as we can see, Ruid, the alphabetically first is G-Sword. If I would set up this with anything other than G-Sword, what would happen is the selection and what it rolls wouldn't match until somebody actually makes a different selection from the pull-down menu. So you always want to make sure that your selection is pointing to the first, alphabetically first entry. So yes, that's it for the character. So now let's have a look at how do we configure the framework itself for putting the character information up. Okay, so now that we've defined the various characters, we can go over to the global and see where these characters are added. So, at the very beginning of global, there is a section that has 2 entries for each character. The first entry, it basically follows the character's player color, and this is the GUID that's associated with the player's character figure. So it's whatever character they're using, that object's ID is what's put here. The second entry, as you can see, already follows the character's name, and you will need to replace here again twice the color. This is what goes and gets all of that information that we've provided for the character and make it available to the framework. By doing it this way, it means that when you add different characters, all of the information for the character is on the character object itself, and then all you need is a small entry here to load it. This allows easy swapping of characters without having to go into the global and finding out where all of that stuff is coded. Okay, then there's a second section right here, and this section defines where this menu, the corresponding menu, will actually appear. So all you need to do is put a build XML and then the XY location of where you want the menu to go. You'll have to play a little bit with the values to figure out what locations represent what positions. And the last parameter is the character name that you want to actually, whose menu you want to create. And that's basically it for defining these. Please be aware that not all computers have the same resolution. So for example, in my game, the player who is playing with the Ash character has a laptop whose resolution is somewhat smaller. So when I had her menu along with the others over here, she was not able to see it. That's why I had to move it out here in order for her to actually see that. So keep that in mind, that Tabletop Simulator does not actually scale the whole screen to the user's resolution. So just be aware that you could be chopping off content if you don't place your menus carefully. The other thing to note is when you're placing your menus, do not place them on top of each other. Even if they're menus for different characters, so a character would only see one of them, Tabletop Simulator doesn't support that. If you do that, most likely either neither of the menus will work, or possibly one will work but not the other. So you've got to lay out your menus so that they don't overlap. This is why I went to pull down menus. Previously, I had all of these a single entry, so they were very quick to click. But for 4 players, that would have taken up so much real estate that half the screen would have been used up just for role menus. So instead, I did this concept of pull down menus and the little do it again button, which means that once a selection is made, if you are constantly using that, such as in a battle, you can just hit the button to roll that again without having to reselect it. So it allows pretty quick access to the various roles without taking up too much real estate. Okay, so lastly, these views over here, as was indicated, currently these views are part of the framework, not the content. I'm still working on adjusting that, because it would make much more sense to have those views locked to the content that's loaded and not the framework. But at the moment, they are part of the framework, and they are defined in scripting. Unlike the other content, which was very near the top, the views are a little bit further down, right here. So here's the framework set up for the cameras. So the first 5 here are the views up there. The rest of these you shouldn't need to touch, because they go over to the trays for the corresponding players, unless of course you decide to relocate the trays, in which case you will have to also update the positions for these cameras. Okay, so lastly, we've got two additional buttons here. And now's the time to discuss those. So the X button is basically a reload button. Normally, when the game is saved, it will save the state of various components in the game, and when you load that, it will load those previously saved states. If you want to have all of the information again read from the character definition, so we were talking about these over here. So if you want all of this reread, you need to hit the X button, and that will cause this information to be reread. If you don't, it will just remember it from the last game. So typically when you load your game, you shouldn't need to use the X button. The only time that you really need to use the X button is, for example, if your characters have leveled up and their hit points, armor class, and potentially skills have changed, then the next time you load your game, hit the X button, that will cause all of this information to be reread, and therefore the hit points and armor class will now show correctly, plus any of your skill modifiers will be updated, and it will be using the correct values. And lastly, we've got the plus icon. So as we discussed earlier, the fog of war that I implemented, basically what it does is it adds the hidden keyword for any content that's hidden that the players shouldn't see. When we start the game, there's a script that runs through all the objects, and if they have hidden in the keywords there, it will change the visibility so that players can't see it, and only the GM will be able to see it. The problem is that when you do the additive load, currently that functionality is not there. Again, it's something that I think can be moved to the content so that when the content is loaded, it will do that automatically. But at the moment, I don't have that happening. So the plus key is the sort of the manual button that after you do an additive load, you can press to re-hide everything that the character shouldn't see. What this means is if you are very concerned about characters not seeing the board when it's loading, you will need to blindfold your players temporarily while the game is loading, because it will, for a brief moment, load with everything visible and then it hides everything. So before doing your additive load, you can ask the players to put on the blindfold. You can do the additive load, and then of course once it's loaded, it will hide everything, and you can ask your players to unblindfold. Yes, that's not ideal right now, but it's kind of the best workaround that I found for a working fog of war that doesn't have the issues that the default fog of war has out of the box. Lastly, as I said, I've got this framework currently set up for 4 players and a GM area. Technically, actually, I have it set up for 3 players and a GM area because one of my players is controlling 2 characters. But that's something that you can change very easily. I've moved the other colors when you go to select the color. I've moved, oh, I do actually have both colors there. But yeah, I've kind of moved the other colors that aren't being used out of the way. But you can go into the saved game and move those back if, for example, you'd like to set this up for more than the 4 players here.